The words coming through my phone sounded colder than winter rain. "Mom, we can't keep making room for everyone. We have our own lives." I sat perfectly still, staring at the kitchen table in my small apartment. My name is Evelyn Carter, and at 67, I had finally learned a lesson that took me far too long to understand. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for are the very people who value you the least. What my son Caleb didn't know was that, only a few hours earlier, I had been sitting across from my attorney, signing documents that changed his future completely. But let me start at the beginning. 35 years earlier, I had held Caleb in my arms for the first time. His tiny fingers curled around mine, and I remember whispering that I would give him every opportunity I possibly could. My husband, George, and I weren't wealthy. George worked as an electrical engineer, while I spent more than 2 decades teaching elementary school. We lived in an ordinary 3-bedroom home in Ohio. We drove dependable cars, avoided unnecessary debt, and saved whatever we could. Every month, we put something into our savings. Sometimes it was $200, sometimes it was $20, but we never stopped. We had 2 children. Caleb was our oldest, followed them 3 years later by our daughter Lillian. Caleb was ambitious from the beginning. As a child, he talked constantly about becoming rich. He wanted the biggest house, the nicest car, and a life far more glamorous than ours. I thought it was youthful dreaming. "Dream as big as you want," I'd tell him. "We'll help you get there." And we did. When Caleb was accepted into college, George and I paid his tuition. By graduation, we'd spent more than $40,000 on his education. We never complained. That was our son. When Caleb graduated, he found work at a marketing company. But after a few years, he wanted to start his own business. He came to our house with a detailed business proposal and asked for $60,000. I still remember him sitting at our kitchen table, leaning forward with excitement. "Dad, Mom, this is my chance. I know I can make it work." George and I discussed it for days. Eventually, we gave him the money, not as a loan, as a gift. "Think of it as part of your inheritance." George told him. Caleb promised he'd make us proud. He did become successful. Within several years, his company had grown into a profitable business with employees, expensive offices, and impressive clients. He bought a huge home in an upscale neighborhood and married Caroline, a woman who seemed to care deeply about appearances. They had 2 children, Mason and Sophie, my grandchildren. I adored those children. Unfortunately, I rarely saw them. The first time I visited Caleb's new house, I was amazed by its size. Marble floors, enormous windows, designer furniture, and rooms that looked as though nobody was actually allowed to use them. Carolyn proudly showed me around. Everything was spotless. Too spotless. At dinner, Mason and Sophie barely spoke. They sat quietly and followed every rule Caroline gave them. I remember thinking they should have been laughing, making a mess, and telling silly stories. Instead, they behaved like miniature executives. After that visit, invitations became rare. There was always an excuse. They were traveling. The children had activities. Caroline's relatives were visiting. They were renovating. Meanwhile, Lillian's life was completely different. She married Marcus, a high school teacher, and they had a daughter named Ruby. They lived modestly and never expected anything from us. Lillian called every Sunday. She asked how I was, not what I could do for her, not what I could give her, just how I was. Then George became sick. The diagnosis was devastating. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors told us it was advanced. We had 8 months together after that diagnosis. 8 months of hospitals, treatments, fear, and trying to pretend everything would somehow be okay. When George died, I felt as though someone had removed the center of my entire life. We had spent more than $200,000 on medical care. Eventually, I had to sell the house where we'd raised our children, but George had prepared for the worst. Years earlier, he'd purchased a substantial life insurance policy. After his funeral and the remaining medical expenses were paid, I had roughly $470,000 left. I was financially secure, but I was completely alone. Every morning, I woke expecting to hear George moving around the kitchen. Every night, I reached toward his side of the bed before remembering that he was gone. Then, 3 days after his funeral, Caleb called. He didn't ask whether I was sleeping. He didn't ask if I was eating. He didn't ask how I was surviving. Instead, his first question was about the insurance money. "Mom, Dad had a pretty big policy, right?" I closed my eyes. "Yes, Caleb. That's good. At least you'll be comfortable." Then, almost immediately, he began telling me about another business opportunity. That was the moment something inside me quietly cracked. I just didn't know yet how much that crack would change everything. After George died, the apartment became unbearably quiet. I had spent 40 years sharing my life with one person. Suddenly, there was only me. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet. His old jacket hung behind the bedroom door. Even his reading glasses sat on the nightstand, as though he might walk through the door at any moment and ask what we were having for dinner. I tried to keep busy. I cleaned. I watched television. I went grocery shopping. But every activity felt meaningless without someone to share it with. Caleb rarely called. When he did, our conversations were short. His work was always demanding. The children were always busy. And Caroline apparently had a schedule that required military precision. Lillian was different. She visited whenever she could. She brought Ruby with her, and suddenly my apartment would fill with noise. Ruby would sit beside me while we baked cookies or watched old movies. Lillian never asked about my savings. She never mentioned the insurance money. She simply wanted her mother around. 2 years passed. Then, one afternoon, I decided to give both of my children a substantial gift. I called Lillian first. "Sweetheart, I want to give you $100,000. There was a long silence. "Mom, what? Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain." She immediately started worrying that I was giving away too much. "Please put it toward Ruby's education," I told her. "Or save it. Whatever makes sense." Lillian eventually accepted. When I called Caleb, his response couldn't have been more different. "100,000? Yes." "Wow, Mom. That's incredibly generous." Then his voice became noticeably more enthusiastic. "You know, that's actually perfect timing. Caroline and I have been planning to remodel the kitchen." A kitchen. That was where his mind went. Not retirement. Not my future. Not whether I had enough to live comfortably. A kitchen. I didn't argue. I simply transferred the money. But something changed inside me after that. I began looking at my life differently. I was 67 years old. I had spent decades working, saving, raising children, supporting my husband, and doing everything I could to make sure my family had opportunities. Yet now I lived alone in a beige apartment. Some days, I wouldn't speak to another person except the cashier at the supermarket. I started noticing families everywhere. A mother laughing with her grown daughter, a grandfather carrying a child on his shoulders, adult siblings having coffee together. Everywhere I looked, I saw the life I wanted. I had children. I had grandchildren. So why did I feel like I didn't belong to any family? One evening, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my bank statement. I had money, more money than I'd ever personally controlled before. But money couldn't sit beside me during dinner. It couldn't laugh at my stories. It couldn't ask how my day had been. I realized I didn't need more money. I needed people. I wanted to spend time with my grandchildren while I was still healthy enough to enjoy them. So, I made a simple decision. I would ask Caleb if I could stay with his family for 1 week, just 7 days. I could help with the children. I could cook. I could take them to school or simply sit around the house and feel like a mother and grandmother again. His house had 5 bedrooms. Surely 1 week wasn't unreasonable. Before making the request, however, I decided to meet with my attorney, Samuel Reed, the same attorney George and I had trusted for years. I wanted my affairs organized. At the appointment, Samuel reviewed my accounts, property records, insurance documents, an existing will. Finally, I looked at him. "I want to change the will." He raised an eyebrow. "How?" "I want Lillian to receive 65% of my estate. Caleb can receive 35%. Samuel studied me carefully. "Are you certain?" "Yes." Then I made another request. "I want all of my liquid assets moved into an account that only I control." He paused. "Is there a particular reason?" I thought about Caleb's phone call after George's funeral. I thought about the kitchen renovation. I thought about how often Lillian had shown up for me without expecting anything. "Call it a precaution," I said. Samuel didn't press me. We completed the paperwork by late morning. Everything was organized exactly as I wanted. I walked out of his office carrying a folder that represented a completely different future. Then I sat in my car. For several minutes, I simply stared through the windshield. I wasn't angry. I wasn't frightened. I felt strangely calm. I picked up my phone and called Caleb. He answered after several rings. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" I could hear people laughing behind him. "Hi, sweetheart. I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, we're having some people over." "What's up?" I took a breath. "I was wondering if I could come stay with you for a week." There was silence. Then I heard him move away from the noise. Mom, let me talk to Caroline." I waited. A few seconds passed, then a minute. When he returned, his voice sounded different. "Mom, we've got a lot going on right now. I understand. Mason has activities. Sophie has lessons. Work is crazy. I can come whenever it's convenient." Another silence. Then Caleb said something that would change our relationship forever. "Honestly, Mom, having house guests right now just isn't practical." I swallowed hard. "I wouldn't be a house guest, Caleb. I'm your mother. I know that. I'm only asking for 7 days." He sighed. "Mom, we're not running a charity." The words landed harder than he could have imagined. I sat silently behind the steering wheel, and for the first time I realized that perhaps Caleb wasn't rejecting my request. Perhaps he was finally showing me exactly how he saw me. For several seconds after Caleb said those words, I couldn't speak. "We're not running a charity." I looked down at my hands resting on the steering wheel. I had spent decades giving that man everything I could, his college education, the money to start his company, $100,000 for a kitchen he probably barely needed, and now I was asking for 7 days with my own son and grandchildren. 7 days. "Caleb," I finally said, keeping my voice calm, "I need you to understand something." "Mom, I really have to get back to everyone. This morning I met with Samuel." He went quiet. "My attorney," I explained. "Why?" I changed my financial arrangements. His tone immediately sharpened. "What does that mean?" "It means every dollar I have is now under my control." Another silence. I continued. "The money you received last year was the final gift I'm giving you. I've also changed my will." "Mom, wait. I've spent my entire life putting my children first. I paid for your education. I helped you build your company. I gave you money when you needed it. I never asked for anything in return. That's not fair." I haven't finished. My voice remained steady. "When I asked you for 1 week with your family, you told me you weren't running a charity. I didn't mean it like that. You said exactly what you meant." "Mom, come on." "No, Caleb, I'm done." I ended the call. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt clear. My hands weren't trembling anymore. I sat alone in my car and realized something painful. I had spent years trying to convince myself that Caleb loved me in his own way. Maybe he did. But love without time, attention, or respect had become almost impossible for me to recognize. I called Lillian. She answered immediately. "Mom, we were just talking about you." I heard Ruby laughing in the background. "We're making cookies," Lillian continued. "Ruby says I keep forgetting the recipe." I smiled. "Unsalted butter," I said. "What?" "You always forget." "Unsalted butter," she laughed. "That's right." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she noticed my voice. "Mom, are you okay?" I wasn't, but somehow talking to her made me feel better. "I wanted to ask you something. Anything. Would it be possible for me to stay with you and Marcus for a week?" There wasn't even a pause. "Of course. I know your house is small." "Mom, who cares? I don't want to impose." "You're my mother. You're not imposing." I closed my eyes. Tears began sliding down my cheeks. "When would you like to come? How about this weekend?" "Perfect," I heard Ruby shout from somewhere nearby. "Grandma's coming," Lillian laughed. "She heard you." Then Ruby's voice came through the phone. "Grandma, you have to come." I laughed through my tears. "I'll be there." That conversation lasted nearly half an hour. We talked about ordinary things, Ruby's school project, Marcus's new responsibilities at work, their cat, a family dinner they were planning. None of it was extraordinary, and yet it felt priceless. 15 minutes after we hung up, Caleb called. I didn't answer. He called again, then again. By the 4th call, I knew something had changed. Finally, a message appeared. "Mom, I think we misunderstood each other. Of course you can visit. Another message followed. Caroline and I would love to have you. Then another. Please call me. I stared at the screen. An hour later, another message arrived. I'm sorry if I sounded harsh. I was stressed. Then, I'm worried about what you said about your accounts and your will. Can we talk? There it was, the truth. He wasn't primarily worried about hurting me. He was worried about losing access to my money. I turned my phone off. That weekend, I packed a suitcase and drove to Lillian's house. It was only 40 minutes away. Yet when I pulled into the driveway, Ruby came running outside before I'd even opened my car door. Grandma! She threw her arms around me. I held her tightly. Marcus followed carrying a smile and immediately reached for my suitcase. Let me take that. You don't have to. I know. He carried it inside anyway. Lillian had prepared a small room for me. It wasn't large. There was a simple bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the backyard. But on the wall was a handmade sign, Welcome home, Grandma. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I cried. Lillian hugged me. It's not much. I shook my head. It's perfect. That first evening, we ate dinner together around their small kitchen table. Nobody cared that the chairs didn't match. Nobody worried about crumbs. Ruby told us a ridiculous story from school. Marcus laughed so hard he nearly dropped his fork, and Lillian kept interrupting to add details. I sat there listening, and suddenly I understood something. Family wasn't about the size of the house. It wasn't about expensive furniture. It wasn't about perfect schedules. Family was about making space, even when there wasn't much space to begin with. That night, I went to bed listening to laughter from the hallway. For the first time since George died, I didn't feel like I was living alone. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. Lillian was already in the kitchen. She looked over her shoulder. Morning, Mom. I smiled. Morning, sweetheart. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed that maybe my story wasn't ending. Maybe it was finally beginning. The week at Lillian's house passed faster than I expected. Every morning began with the smell of coffee and the sound of Ruby moving around the kitchen. I helped pack lunches, listened to stories about school, and discovered that Ruby had a remarkable talent for turning ordinary events into dramatic adventures. On Monday morning, she asked me to walk with her to the bus stop. We held hands as she explained a science project about the planets. When the bus arrived, she hugged me. See you after school, Grandma. I watched her climb aboard. Something about those simple words stayed with me. See you after school. I had spent years hoping Caleb would make room for me in his life. Yet here I was, being welcomed into Lillian's life without having to beg. On Tuesday, Marcus asked me to help him sort some papers for his students. We sat at the dining table for nearly an hour, talking about his work. He didn't treat me like someone who had come to stay temporarily. He treated me like part of the household. On Wednesday, Lillian and I went grocery shopping. It was such a small thing, but I enjoyed every minute. We argued playfully over which pasta sauce was best. We compared prices. She told me about a difficult patient she'd encountered at work, and I listened. For once, I wasn't sitting in a silent apartment waiting for the phone to ring. I was living. On Thursday evening, we all watched a movie together. Ruby eventually fell asleep against my shoulder. I looked around the room. Lillian was curled up beside Marcus. Ruby was sleeping peacefully. The television played softly in the background. And I realized this was what I had been missing. Not money, not luxury. Connections. The next afternoon, Lillian and I sat outside while Ruby played in the yard. Mom, she said carefully, Caleb has been calling me. I figured he would. He says you're being unreasonable. I smiled sadly. What else did he say? He thinks you changed your will because of one bad conversation. I looked toward the yard. He told me we weren't running a charity. Lillian's expression hardened. He actually said that. Exactly. She shook her head. Mom, you've given him so much. I know. Then why does he still act like you're the one asking for too much? I didn't have an answer. Instead, I told her about the $100,000. He spent it on the kitchen, I said. Lillian stared at me. While you were living alone? I nodded. She looked down. What did you do with mine? You don't have to tell me. I put most of it into Ruby's college account. We used some to repair Marcus's car. I smiled. I know. I wanted to make sure Ruby had something waiting for her when she grows up. That is exactly why I gave it to you." Lillian reached across the table and held my hand. "Mom, you don't have to give me anything else. I know. And you don't have to change your will for me." "I know that too." I squeezed her hand. "This isn't about rewarding you with money. It's about recognizing the person you've become." She started crying. I continued. "You've never treated me like a bank account. You've treated me like your mother." She wiped her eyes. "I love you, Mom. I love you too." That evening, I began thinking seriously about my future. I didn't want to return to my apartment. The thought of spending another year alone there made my chest ache. So, the following night, I approached Lillian and Marcus. "There is something I've been thinking about." They both looked at me. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "I don't want to go back." Lillian immediately understood. "You mean I want to stay here?" She looked at Marcus. He looked at her. They exchanged one of those silent conversations married couples seem to have without saying a word. Then Marcus smiled. "The room is yours." I laughed nervously. "You haven't even discussed it." "We've discussed it before you arrived," he admitted. Lillian nodded. "We've wanted you closer for years." I covered my mouth. "But I don't want to become a burden." "You won't," she said. "I can help with groceries." "Fine, I can help with Ruby, definitely. And I'll contribute toward the household." Marcus raised his hands. "Groceries are acceptable. Rent is not." I laughed. "Deal." 2 weeks later, I moved in permanently. The day I brought the last of my belongings over, I felt strangely emotional. I had lived in that apartment for years. It had been lonely, but it had also been where I learned to stand on my own. Now I was closing that chapter. Caleb called repeatedly during those 2 weeks. 37 times, according to my phone. I answered once. "Mom, thank goodness. You sound relieved. I've been worried about you." "Have you?" "Yes." He paused. "Caroline and I talked. We want you to come stay with us." I almost laughed. "I've already made other arrangements." "What do you mean?" "I've moved in with Lillian and Marcus." The silence was immediate. "You moved in, yes. You didn't even give us another chance." I took a breath. "Caleb, I gave you 35 years of chances." "Mom, that's not fair." "It is fair." I said I was sorry. "You're sorry because you're afraid of what might happen to your inheritance." "That isn't true." "Then answer one question." He didn't respond. "When was the last time you called me simply because you wanted to know how I was?" Silence. "Not on my birthday. Not on a holiday. Not because you needed something. Just because you missed your mother." He couldn't answer. And that silence told me everything. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished chasing someone who didn't want to be caught. "Caleb," I said softly, "I love you. I always will. But I'm done measuring my worth by how much attention you give me." He exhaled heavily. "Then what happens to the inheritance?" There it was, the question I'd been expecting. I closed my eyes. "Now you know why I had to make my decision." I could hear Caleb breathing on the other end of the phone. "So how much am I getting?" he finally asked. There it was. "Not, are you happy, Mom?" "Not, do you feel better now?" "Not even. Can we fix this?" His first real question was about the inheritance. I looked across the room at Lillian. She was helping Ruby with her homework, completely unaware of the conversation. "You'll receive something," I said. "How much?" "About 35% of my estate." There was a long pause. 35? "Yes." "Mom, that's not fair." I almost smiled. "Why isn't it fair? I'm your son, and Lillian is my daughter, but you're giving her almost everything. I'm leaving most of my estate to the person who has been there for me. That's because she lives nearby." "No, Caleb. She lives nearby because she makes an effort." He didn't respond. I continued. "Your sister never asked what was in my bank account. She never asked what your father left me. She never asked what she would inherit." "I'm not asking because I'm greedy." "Then why is that the first thing you wanted to know?" Silence. I could hear someone speaking in the background on his end. "Probably Caroline." Then Caleb's voice returned. "She isn't going to believe this." "Who?" "Caroline." I shook my head. "Give her my regards." "Mom, you're really doing this?" I already did. I ended the call, then I blocked his number. I sat quietly for several minutes. I expected to feel guilty. Instead, I felt relieved. For years, I had confused guilt with responsibility. I thought being a good mother meant constantly giving money, giving time, giving forgiveness, giving second chances. But there comes a point when giving becomes another word for allowing someone to take advantage of you. I didn't want revenge against Caleb. I wanted peace, and I finally understood that protecting my future wasn't cruelty. It was self-respect. The next morning, Lillian and I had coffee together before she left for work. "Did you talk to Caleb?" she asked. "Yes, how did it go?" he asked about the inheritance. She closed her eyes. "Of course he did. I told him about the 35%. Lillian looked uncomfortable. "Mom, I still don't want you to think you have to leave me everything." "I don't. Then why are you doing it?" "Because I want to." She reached across the table. "You've already given me enough." "No," I said gently. "You gave me something too." "What?" "A place to belong." She smiled. "That doesn't have a price." "Exactly. That was when I realized how different my two children had become. Caleb had always measured value in numbers, business revenue, property prices, cars, renovations, investment returns. I had once admired his ambition. Now I understood that ambition without gratitude could leave a person incredibly wealthy and incredibly poor at the same time. Lillian had less money. Her house was smaller. Her car wasn't new. Her kitchen had old cabinets. But every evening there was laughter. Every morning someone asked whether I slept well. Every weekend, Ruby wanted me to watch something with her. I wasn't wealthy in the way Caleb was, but I was rich in every way that suddenly mattered. A month later, something unexpected happened. Lillian came home carrying an envelope. "This came for you." I recognized Caleb's handwriting. I opened it carefully. It was a letter. He wrote that he regretted what he'd said. He claimed he'd been under enormous pressure at work and hadn't realized how his words sounded. He said he missed me. He said the children missed me. He asked Lillian to convince me to reconsider. I read the letter twice, then I folded it and placed it on the table. "Are you going to answer him?" Lillian asked. "I don't know. You don't have to." "I know." She sat beside me. "Mom, you can forgive him without giving him everything he wants." "I've been thinking about that." "What do you want?" I stared at the photographs on the wall. There was one of George holding Ruby when she was a baby. Another showed Lillian and me laughing in the backyard. There were pictures from holidays, birthdays, ordinary family dinners. My life was finally filled with moments instead of empty rooms. "I want Caleb to understand that my decision isn't punishment." Lillian nodded. "Then maybe tell him that." So I wrote him a letter. I told him I loved him. I told him I wasn't trying to destroy his life. But I also told him that love didn't mean unlimited access to my money or my time. I explained that his words had forced me to see something I'd avoided for years. I had been giving him everything because I was afraid that if I stopped giving, he'd stop loving me. That realization hurt more than anything he'd said on the phone. I told him I wasn't cutting him out completely. He would still receive 35%. But the rest would go to Lillian, not because she had demanded it. Not because I wanted to punish him, because she had shown me what unconditional love looked like. I mailed the letter. Then I let go. I couldn't control what Caleb thought. I couldn't control whether Caroline agreed. I couldn't control whether he ever understood. But I could control one thing, what I did with the years I had left. And I decided those years would no longer be spent begging someone to make room for me. They would be spent sitting at tables where a chair was already waiting. 3 months have passed since I moved into Lillian's home. Sometimes I still wake up expecting to see the beige walls of my old apartment. Then I hear footsteps in the hallway. I hear Ruby laughing. I smell coffee coming from the kitchen. And I remember, I'm home. My bedroom is small, but I made it mine. I painted the walls a soft yellow and placed photographs of George on the dresser. One picture shows him laughing at our old kitchen table. Another was taken the summer before he became sick. Every morning, I look at those pictures and remind myself that the life we built wasn't wasted. George and I worked hard for our savings because we wanted our children to have opportunities. We gave Caleb his opportunity. He turned it into a successful business. We paid for his education. We helped him get started. We gave him $100,000 when he wanted to remodel his kitchen. We did our part. But I finally learned that parents aren't required to finance their children's entire lives, and children aren't entitled to their parents' money simply because they share the same last name. These days, my life is wonderfully ordinary. I make breakfast on weekends. I help Ruby with her homework. Sometimes she asks me questions about math that I have absolutely no idea how to answer. I've had to watch several online lessons just to keep up with her algebra. She thinks it's hilarious. Marcus and I have started playing chess every Tuesday evening. He usually wins. I insist that he cheats. He insists that I'm simply a terrible chess player. Neither of us has convinced the other. Lillian and I drink coffee together every morning before she leaves for work. Those quiet 15 minutes have become one of my favorite parts of the day. We talk about everything. Work, family, old memories, plans for the weekend. Nothing extraordinary, yet those ordinary conversations mean more to me than all the expensive things Caleb ever bought. One evening, Ruby came home upset. A girl at school had said something cruel to her. Instead of disappearing into her bedroom, Ruby came straight to the kitchen. "Grandma?" I looked up. "What happened?" She sat beside me and started crying. I listened. Then I taught her how George used to make his favorite cinnamon cookies. By the time the first batch came out of the oven, she was smiling again. That moment stayed with me. This was what I had wanted. Not money. Not a bigger house. Not a perfect life. I wanted to matter to someone. I wanted my family to know I was there. Caleb eventually stopped calling. I heard through Lillian that Caroline had questioned whether I was capable of making my own financial decisions. Apparently, she wondered if someone had influenced me. Lillian told her exactly what she needed to know. Mom is perfectly capable of making her own decisions. Then she ended the conversation. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. For years, I had worried about what Caleb thought of me. Now I didn't. That doesn't mean I hate him. I don't. He's still my son. A mother doesn't simply stop loving her child because that child disappoints her. But love can exist alongside boundaries. I can love Caleb without giving him unlimited access to my money. I can forgive him without pretending his words didn't hurt. I can wish him well without allowing him to control my future. And most importantly, I can stop waiting for him to become the son I imagined. Maybe one day he'll understand, maybe he won't. That's no longer something I can control. What I can control is how I spend the rest of my life. I spent too many years believing that my value came from what I could provide. I was a mother, so I gave. I was a wife, so I sacrificed. I was a grandmother, so I sent gifts. I thought being needed was the same as being loved. It isn't. Being loved means someone makes room for you even when they don't have much room to spare. Lillian taught me that. Her house isn't large. Her schedule isn't easy. Her family doesn't have unlimited money. But when I asked whether I could stay for a week, she didn't calculate the inconvenience. She simply said yes. That's what I will remember. Not the marble countertops, not the expensive cars, not the size of Caleb's house. I'll remember a little bedroom with a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home, Grandma." I'll remember Ruby running down the driveway. I'll remember Marcus carrying my suitcase. I'll remember sitting around a crowded kitchen table and laughing until my stomach hurt. And I'll remember the moment I realized that I wasn't asking for too much. I had simply been asking the wrong person. My inheritance is arranged exactly as I want it. Lillian will receive the larger share. Caleb will receive enough to know that I never stopped loving him, but neither of them will receive my money because they demanded it. They will receive what I choose to leave behind because I've earned the right to decide. If there's one thing I've learned at 67, it's this. You can love your children without allowing them to take advantage of you. You can forgive someone without inviting them to hurt you again, and you can start over at any age. I thought my life ended when George died. Then I thought my family had forgotten me. I was wrong. My life didn't end, it changed. And sometimes, the door you desperately want someone else to open isn't the door you need. Sometimes you have to walk away from the closed door, turn around, and notice the people standing behind you, waiting, making room. Calling your name, that is where I found my peace. That is where I found my family. And finally, that is where I found myself.